Our fourth and final speaker in this session is Daniel Malan. He is a senior lecturer in ethics and governance at the University of Stellenbosch's Business School, and he's head of their unit of corporate governance. Previously, he was a director with KPMG Sustainability Services, and he was the regional coordinator for ethics and integrity services in their Europe, Middle East, and African programs. He's a member of the Anti-Corruption Working Group of the United Nations Principle for Responsible Management Education. And so a warm welcome to Daniel Malan.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. The thoughts that I'll share with you today are part of my PhD research project that I'm conducting under the supervision of Ollie Williams. I had the opportunity to visit Notre Dame for 2 months last year, and many of the discussions that I had with him, also with George, with Lee, with Antti and others, as well as Tom Donaldson at the Wharton School, really helped me, and a lot of what I hope you will find interesting and useful today could also be attributed to their views and their support. The title of my presentation is A Journey into Moral Free Space. And the purpose of this talk really is, and that's the big part of my research, is to share with you some ideas on how I believe that the concept of moral free space and the theory of integrative social contracts theory that Donaldson and Dunphy developed can help to strengthen the global compact. As you would have heard also from my brief CV, I've spent more time doing consulting than being in academia. So I'm intrigued by the concept of bracademia, and I really like the quote by John Boatwright when he critiqued the work of Donaldson. He said, "How can any theory of ethics that is rigorous enough to pass muster with picky philosophers possibly give guidance to busy, hard-headed business managers?" But I think that is a challenge that we should take up, because if we don't do it, then we'll lose out both on the academic side and also on the business side. Sandra mentioned some of the crises from the 90s and the early 2000s. I think perhaps good just to pause a minute to say that we have progressed since the 70s and the 80s. Just two brief quotes. Milton Friedman, who said, "Those businessmen who argue that business has responsibilities to provide employment, eliminate discrimination and avoid pollution, are preaching pure and unadulterated socialism." And John Ladd said, "We cannot and must not expect formal organizations or their representatives acting in their official capacities to be honest, courageous, considerate, sympathetic, or to have any kind of moral integrity. Such concepts are not in the vocabulary, so to speak, of the organizational language game." So we've made some progress since then. As a pracademic, aspiring pracademic perhaps, in terms of doing both academic work but also working with corporations, what I have up here is an attempt to help companies, but also for my own purposes, to make sense of this concept of responsibility. And I think there are 5 main components that I've identified that could be helpful. Firstly, the understanding of responsibility, and that's where the normative aspect comes in. That's where I think we should move beyond just the business case for moral and corporate social responsibility or corporate responsibility, because if we only focus on the business case, we're going to get into trouble. Then there's the taking of responsibility, the act of commitment, governing and managing responsibility. And I think from a governance point of view, it's important to make the distinction between governance and the role of the board of directors, as opposed to senior executives and people who need to manage responsibility in the organization. Reporting, we've spoken a lot about reporting, the way in which organizations can then communicate with their stakeholders on how they have taken or managed or governed responsibility. And of course, there's the ever-present regulating aspect as well, where governments, or either through voluntary or mandatory aspects, corporate responsibility has to be regulated in one way or another. Now, I won't say that much about integrative social contracts theory, because it can be quite complicated and I have limited time. But there's one slide with bullets and then a picture on the next slide that I hope will explain the basic principles. Donaldson and Danby, who developed this theory, argue that local economic communities have morals-free space, and then they define that as freedom of individuals to form or join communities and to act jointly to establish moral rules applicable to the members of a specific community. And they term that microsocial contracts that must be grounded in consent, but also individual members should have the right to exit or to voice opposition to those contracts. If it is generated within moral free space and has the support of the majority, it's authentic, and in order for it to become obligatory or legitimate, it must be compatible with hypernorms. So just to try and summarize that, then we have the hypernorms, those values or principles that are valid in any context, universal moral values, but on the outside of that you have moral free space where in terms of context or respect for local customs, local traditions, those local economic communities have the ability to generate micro-contracts, and in a moment I'll share with you a few examples linked also to some of the Global Compact categories. But of course, they must still be compatible with hypernorms. As soon as they cannot be compatible, or if they're not compatible with hypernorms, then they go into the red area of unethical, unacceptable behavior. My argument, bringing this back to the Global Compact, is that the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact could be regarded as those hypernorms that Donaldson and Danby talk about, that these hypernorms can and should guide corporate responsibility programs within any corporation, but within that, then, companies should be encouraged to explore and engage with moral free space, where they can take the context into account and where they can display respect for local concerns, local customs, and local traditions. So, coming back to my little framework about corporate responsibility, I then put the United Nations Global Compact into the center as one example of a voluntary regulatory initiative. And then if you look at the specific requirements of the compact, we've got the CEO and the board statement as the act of taking responsibility. You've got the requirement to mainstream these ideas, to link them to the Millennium Development Goals, etc., explaining the need to manage and govern responsibility. And of course, the COP would fit neatly into the act of reporting on responsibility. And just to take that one step further, if we look at the Global Compact management model, again, those activities of commit, assess, define, implement, measure, and communicate, I think, fit quite nicely into those categories of taking responsibility, governing, managing, and reporting. My position then is that integrative social contracts theory could, and I don't want to make it another step in that model. I think we don't want to mess too much with the model, but it could become the backdrop of that management model to say that we have to take the normative aspects of the compact seriously and therefore regard the 10 principles as hypernorms. Of course, just to mention also that there is a very wide regulatory range. The Global Compact is only one example. Last year at the university, we launched a publication jointly with KPMG, UNEP, and the GRI. It's available on our website, and I'll show you the link at the end, where we investigated 30 different countries, and we came up with a few hundred examples of both voluntary and mandatory standards in terms of addressing sustainability aspects, all with a reporting requirement. So we have to take that into account. Two examples here, ISO 26000 might fit more into the managing and governing aspect, and of course the GRI, and also the work that's currently being done by the International Integrated Reporting Committee would fit on the reporting side. So let's look at a few examples of how companies could engage with moral free space. The old example that Donaldson uses in some of his earlier writings is the one of Levi Strauss in India. So this predates the Global Compact, but they use the example where Levi Strauss made a conscious decision to employ children below the legal minimum age within some of those environments where they operated. They then compelled those children to go to school at the same time, paid for their education while they were working for the company, and then offered them a full-time job once they reached the legal age. Quite a nice example, I think, of moral free space if you hear child labor, immediately people would say, not a chance that you can come up with any example that would be acceptable from a moral point of view, but I think this is one good example. Another one that I think is perhaps slightly more controversial, but more recent, is Wholesome, that was struggling with the problem of whether they could or should operate in Sudan. They then became a member of the, the International Committee of the Red Cross Corporate Support Group. They initiated, for example, the Clean Water in Sudan project, and I think the jury is still out whether this is a good or a bad example of a company simply buying a license to operate, or whether they're really grappling with some of those issues and trying to make a contribution to work in a country that has been ridden with huge problems in terms of human rights violations. From my own experience, when I worked with KPMG, I was fortunate to be involved in the development of our global code of conduct. We also worked with Tom Donaldson. And what we tried to do there was, again, to apply this theory where there was a global code of conduct that was developed by the firm, but also member firm codes around the world that, again, would allow that free space for firms to make provision for local customs or local requirements. And the ones that I was involved in directly was KPMG in Southern Africa, where we could support affirmative action, black economic empowerment, or in Botswana, the whole idea of a localization practice, and see this as moral free space, which does not necessarily contradict the hypernorm of anti-discrimination, because it is relevant within the particular context within which the firm operated. Of course, there are also limits to moral free space, where companies can then make the decision to say, well, in this case, the hypernorm should override moral free space. We heard yesterday from Nestle that they have the same wastewater management standards in all countries, regardless of the local legal requirements. And also on the anti-corruption front, I think the zero tolerance approach that many companies would have is an example where you would say, well, this is a hypernorm, and we cannot follow the when in Rome, do as the Romans approach. And social contracts theory is very particular about not being a relativist theory. So those are examples where the hypernorms would not allow the possibility of free space. To conclude, bringing this back again to the Global Compact, I think the traditional approach of many companies, probably the majority of the 6,000 odd companies that are members at the moment, is that they say, we like the UN brand, our values are compatible with the 10 principles, and we publish a sustainability report in any case, so it's a no-brainer, we can do this easily. That's what can bring us up to 6,000 quite quickly, but I think that's also what caused 2,000 to drop off already. This approach might get us to the 20,000 by 2020, but I don't believe this is the correct route to follow. If you follow the IICT approach, and I'm not suggesting that the Global Compact should embrace one particular academic theory, but I think this thinking could help companies to understand, and sorry for the small font, but as an alternative to this, a company could say we support the Compact because it provides a moral framework of responsible citizenship. To prevent the Compact from becoming a list of empty and vague principles, we will actively investigate moral free space and do some of the things that I've showed you that some companies have done in the past. And then finally, we understand that these activities we will engage in have to be both authentic, in other words, supported by stakeholders, and in line with the substantive hypernorms of the Compact and other hypernorms that we might identify. The 10 principles of the Compact are hypernorms, but they're not necessarily the only 10 ones. That is also an ongoing debate and discussion. Thank you very much. That is my email address, and also if you want to have more information about the Center or the Unit for Corporate Governance, that's our website. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Daniel? Any questions for any of our remaining 3 panelists? Kirk had to run and catch a flight, but the other 3 are here. Yeah, George?
Daniel, what would you answer to the question Sandra raised at the beginning of the session? What would you tell Sandra? I mean, she said it's much broader. It's not just about corporate responsibility the problem we face, but they are systemic issues worldwide. How would you put your contribution into that context?
I think it would be to say that first and very important step of understanding responsibility would have to include that inclusive approach of understanding business as not at the center but at the side, and to understand the systemic issues, and those then should be built into the commitment, the governance and the management of responsibility.
I think if we took Daniel's notion of hypernorm and Donaldson Dunphy's notion of hypernorms seriously, and of course I would agree that the compact represents one set of those, possibly universal principles, then, and we really lived those principles in all things, then we would have a system with more integrity.
Any other questions for our panelists? Well, again, join me in thanking them for an excellent set of presentations.